dark comedy horror coming out of New Zealand, introducing us to a kid named Angus as he watches from a distance as his father and brother round up sheep in their local field. Angus doesn't appear to be all that fond of sheep, or his brother for that matter. He picks up an axe, decapitates a sheep, and terrifies his younger brother while wearing it on his face. The pair are then told by Miss Mac, the woman who looks after them, that their father has been involved in an accident and is dead. Cuts to 15 years later, and we see a man sitting in the back of a taxi, absolutely terrified as it stopped and surrounded by sheep. It's Henry. We're then introduced to two animal rights activists as they're sneaking into a field, Grant and Experience. Henry arrives back at the family home, and it's pretty clear that he's been gone away a long time, as while Miss Mac, not recognizing him, almost blows the back of his head off with a shotgun. He goes to see his now successful, business-savvy brother, who's taken over the farm and turned the majority of it into a genetic engineering operation. He's preparing to give a speech to people from all over the world, as they're soon to arrive at the farm to witness the results of his operation, before writing Henry a check for $2 million, essentially buying him out of the farm that the pair inherited from their father, leaving Angus fully in control of it and all of its operations. The activists reach the laboratory with the simple objective to covertly gather visual evidence of wrongdoings, but Grant takes it upon himself to hop the fence, sprint down the hill, and steal a sample from one of their boxes right in front of them. And in a not very incognito fashion, Greg sprints away with it while being pursued and ends up dropping and shattering the sample all over the ground, which is followed by this conscious placenta-looking creature climbing up his back and biting off his ear, before we then see that same mutated lamb make its way up into a sheep field where it bites one of them. While Henry's on the farm, he's taken up to the fields by Tucker, a childhood friend and the now farm manager, and the pair are then stopped in their tracks by a bitten sheep. Tucker gets out to lift it over the fence while Henry holds back, when suddenly, Experience sneaks up behind them and steals the rifle out of the back of the car. Experience believes that the pair have something to do with the lab, and while Tucker is employed by Angus, he has nothing to do with that side of things and manages the traditional farming jobs. And after she tries to get them to take her to Grant, with her being completely unaware of how to use a firearm, Tucker basically just asks her for the rifle back, and she obliges. Meanwhile, we see the anti-meat-eating activist as he's shaking in the woods, unaware of what's happening to him, before suddenly being consumed by the overwhelming urge to grab the rabbit in existence before savagely biting into it. We're then introduced to a local resident in his home, preparing his 5-star meal, when all of a sudden he's lured to the front door before being violently attacked by something. The trio spot smoke coming from that very house, and upon further investigation, discover it completely trashed and covered in blood, or spaghetti and sausages. They're confronted by a particularly aggressive sheep in the man's house, and as they shut it out of the room, Experience tells them that this is the result of Angus's genetic engineering operation, hangry sheep. They then find the owner of the house, slumped over with a chunk bitten out of his neck, when suddenly the sheep rams its head through the door, and it takes 2 direct shots to the skull at close range to kill it. After leaving the home, to find it surrounded by seemingly normal sheep, Experience manages to calm Henry enough to have him walk back to the car, but as they do get into it, so does a sheep, and it manages to bite Tucker as they're attempting to drive away. They decide to drive it off a cliff and kill it, the exact same cliff that Henry's father fell off 15 years ago while attempting to chase a sheep. Grant spots Angus's car and decides to make it stop. And after realizing that Angus is more of a Burger King type of guy, he bites down into his hand before making a run for it. And as the trio are attempting to walk back to the farm, Tucker notices something isn't quite right with his foot, and after removing his boot to assess the damage, he realizes that he's got a sheep foot. Suddenly, they're charged at by a stampede of very hungry sheep and forced to hide in the genetics lab. And while they're in there, they discover a strung up and skinned sheep sliced open with its heart still pumping. They're then confronted by Angus and the lab scientists, and after pointing the rifle at them, Tucker's injected with something immobilizing him, while Henry and Experience are forced to leave. And when they exit, they're charged at by the still waiting sheep and forced to hide behind a fenced-off pit used for very obvious environmentally friendly disposal. Angus walks up to the pair unbothered by the sheep, presumably because the infection has already begun to take a hold of him, and as Henry refuses the money to be bought out, Angus stands by and watches as the pair fall and slip into the pit. They land on a grotesque pile of disorganized organs, and using a candle, they're able to venture into the cave, and as they descend further into it, they're forced to climb their way through a narrow and claustrophobic hole as the sound of sheep jumping into the cave has begun to increase. They just manage to pull themselves through as a sheep is snapping at Henry's feet, so using the candle, he throws it onto the animal to make some impromptu lamb steaks. They manage to find a way out, and after heading to a local barn, they hear strange noises emanating from it. So knowing that there's a bunch of deranged human-eating sheep in the area, They walk into the dark room where the creepy noises are coming from, and upon entering, they discover a large sheep-man hybrid shearing himself. It's Grant. He sends Henry flying across the room, and as Grant is about to get experience, Henry jumps back up and thrusts the shears into his neck, giving the pair the opportunity to lock Grant inside. Back inside the lab, Tucker's transformation has already begun to accelerate, with his face quickly beginning to change before it then morphs into a human-sheep hybrid. Lucky for Tucker, the scientist is able to reverse the transformation with the use of a serum, but as she leaves the lab to deliver it to an infected Angus, she notices her dead colleague before being chased and then killed herself by the sheep. Back at Angus's event, things are starting to pick up as the guests have all arrived, and once he begins his speech, he realizes that he's having quite the hard time getting through it. He reveals to the crowd his perfectly genetically engineered sheep, but all of a sudden, it begins calling out loudly and uncontrollably, and as Angus is trying to calm the sheep down, he suddenly notices a horde of enraged sheep sprinting their way down the hill and towards the event. The guests are violently and brutally attacked as this wave of lamb chops begins tearing them limb from limb and spreading their organs all over the field. And as Angus looks down, he notices that he's begun to change. Henry and Experience arrive at the event, shortly followed by Miss Mac, and as the pair jump into the car to flee, they ram into a sheep standing in the road. They make it back to the farmhouse to suddenly realize that Grant has made his way in there, so a quick-thinking Henry throws a bottle of mint sauce over him with Grant burning from the holy mint sauce. He's about to kill Henry when all of a sudden, Experience grabs a chopstick off the table and thrusts it into a pressure point that causes temporary paralysis, or permanent paralysis. As the sheep begin to swarm outside of the house, Henry opens up the door to Angus's study to find him, getting to know his prized genetic sheep inside and out. And as the trio head upstairs to find a way out, Henry discovers that somehow he's been bitten in all of the commotion, and after getting down from the house and realizing that he's probably not got much time left, Henry is going to press onwards alone to stop Angus, while Miss Mac and Experience are going to leave in the car. But just before they do, Henry and Experience share a kiss, Using the sheepskin covers from Miss Mac's car, Henry begins crawling his way across the field as the zombie sheep are snacking on the remains of Angus's guests. But as he's doing so, Henry runs into a little trouble as a sheep, mounts him, pulling off the disguise in the process. And as all the creatures look up to see this strange man crawling across the floor for some reason, they instantly ignore it to continue eating the entrails of the unlucky victims, as Henry is already infected. It's the exact same reason that Angus was never attacked as he watched the pair fall into the disposal pit. Miss Mac and Experience decide against leaving Henry and begin speeding through a field, blowing to pieces every sheep-man hybrid that they come across. Angus is attempting to flee in his own plane, but the trio know that if he were to leave, then not only would someone who likes to get uncomfortably intimate with sheep leave too, but also the infection. But as Henry gets closer, Angus's transformation has begun to finalize. Henry's pounced at by Angus, and as he has him up by his throat, Henry uses the Golden Shear Award won by his father to stab Angus to get free, when all of a sudden, Angus begins to fully transform. With the plane running and unattended, it lurches forwards and begins to go around in circles. So using the skills we saw Henry use as a small child with his father, he enlists the help of the sheepdog to command Angus to stay where he is, which puts him right in the way of the propellers that slice open his back. And as Henry thinks it's done, Angus suddenly stands up behind him before Tucker shows up and injects the pair with the serum that was used on him. And using the sheepdog, they're able to herd all of the infected animals into the barn, when all of a sudden Angus, somehow still alive, stands up and walks around with all of his fleshy bits exposed and flapping in the wind. And when he asks the sheep to reinfect him, they oblige by biting down on his crown jewels and ripping him to shreds, leaving nothing left behind to be infected. And just to make sure, with all of the sheep passing a lot of gas due to their human binge-eating diet, Henry pulls out a lighter and uses the methane gas to blow them all up. We then see the trio the next day as they use the serum to cure Glenn, still having the chopsticks sticking out of his body, before he's then herded into a pen with the rest of the cured and probably incredibly confused people who all probably feel very full due to the amount of consumed human remains. And then the movie comes to an end with a shot of the sheepdog barring as if it's a sheep.